Welcome to the Violin Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Mrugala, where I interview violinists from around the world. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining us today. And if you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit the subscribe button for future episodes. My guest today is a violin maker based in Brattleboro, Vermont, who has made over 1,000 instruments and has received awards from the Violin Society of America. His instruments are played by various artists around the world in a variety of musical settings. Please let me welcome Douglas Cox. Doug, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the Violin Podcast today. How are you doing today?
Oh, it's a pleasure. We're recording this on a beautiful sunny reprieve of summer afternoon here in Vermont, so it's great. The world is beautiful.
Fabulous. Yeah. And I had the pleasure of seeing your workshop in person, and you're like in the woods, and it's a beautiful place to be creative. And I'm sure I would love to talk to you about your workspace and the types of violins that you make. But first off, for people who are not familiar with who you are and your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in becoming a luthier and how you started making instruments?
Well, when I graduated from high school in 1966 and was not too keen on going to college or doing something academic, and I'd learned through model making that I love to do fine work with my hands and have a musical inclination as well, although I had barely started to learn to play the violin at that point. I joined a country dance band playing first banjo and flute, but then I picked up violin to do that. So that was my introduction to the violin. So to find some way to put my interests together, I found my way to the violin making school in Mittenwald, Germany, which is in a beautiful Bavarian alpine village. Half of the year snow-capped peaks all around, and crystal clear streams going through, and I'm trying to think. The young women that I was interested in weren't necessarily in dirndls, but most of their mothers were. So it was just a very picturesque place to be off to. So I went there to follow my interests and for adventure, and but without the commitment that I was going to be a violin maker. It was something to do. It was something to explore. But there were other kids in the school, other young people who came from violin families, and they were there to follow their family tradition. But I was there to explore, and was there for a couple of years. Came back to the States and worked for J. Bradley Taylor, who was instrumental in my going to Mittenwald in the first place. And I spent what I thought was going to be a year in his shop just because I needed a job. And that grew into 10 years and an awful lot of very valuable experience of seeing great instruments, working with players of all abilities and temperaments. One of the keys to success as a violin maker is being able to work with the personalities of players. So that was great training, and then after being there for the decade of the 70s, basically, because I still hadn't found anything better to do, a better way to make a living, I just kind of kept going and gradually transitioned from doing repair and restoration work, which was the bulk of what I was doing for Brad, into building new instruments. And we moved here to Vermont in 1983, and that was about the point at which I transitioned to pretty much just making new instruments full time. One of the advantages or characteristics of working in a rural location is that there's not a lot of street traffic that comes through to take you away from the bench. And so my career from after the time in Boston, really focused on making new instruments, and I've done that with dedication. And as with most things in life, the more you do it, the better and easier it becomes. So that's the thumbnail.
That's fabulous. Thank you for sharing all of that for our audience today. And my question for you is, was there anyone in particular that kind of influenced you into becoming a maker? As you said that after high school, that's when you were first introduced to the violin. But was there someone or a certain situation that encouraged you to make that step and pursue violin making school in Germany?
Again, Brad Taylor, who also, I was living in New Hampshire at the time, which is where I grew up, and he was a Dover, New Hampshire native, and so he was my introduction in that way. I think after that, getting to know a number of very fine players who were encouraging in making new instruments, and provided both the inspiration of great instruments, understanding how great instruments work with great players. Mary Lou Churchill was probably the most inspirational. She was just a very lovely person and just 100% encouragement. Eric Rosenblith, James Buswell, basically the Boston Teacher Corps, Joey Silverstein. They were all people that took an interest in me and encouraged me to go forward. Part of that encouragement was making their instruments available to me to study and to learn from.
And of course, for our audience who don't know who Joey Silverstein is, he's a legendary Boston Symphony Orchestra concertmaster who stayed many, many years as a concertmaster. And also for a moment, he was conductor for Utah Symphony, which I thought was also interesting. Great legendary player, had that very nice, warm sound. I remember when I was attending school in Boston that he was a faculty member there, and he had such wisdom, beyond, there was an entire studio class of Bach, just talking about Bach sonatas and partitas, and the way he approached the music, and not to mention the way he approached sound was also very interesting. And Doug, you mentioned that you were studying these instruments of well-renowned players. What were some of the things that you were looking for as you were studying these instruments and approaching the bench as you made new violins?
Well, I think let me think. Joey had a Guad. The others I mentioned all have Strads.
Mm-hmm.
So it's how do they work? What is a violin supposed to do? With the exception of one of the instruments that I got to do some restoration work, you generally don't get to take the instrument apart to see what is on the inside, but there are lots of non-intrusive ways to be able to get information about the instrument. So there's a pretty standard set of data points, that one can collect. But as much as anything, or at least what I come to understand, is that it's not about any particular part. There isn't any secret, or if there is a secret, it's that nothing is ultimately important, and yet nothing is unimportant. And what makes a violin great is when all of the pieces work together. And it's not as though the arching has to be this way, the thicknesses have to be like that, the texture of the varnish has to be like this. But it's when all of those things work together. So that's I'll add another. Probably the most inspiration or the most support I had moving forward was was JB Viome. It was pretty standard in the many Viomes came through Brad's shop when I was working there, and most of them needed to have the bass bars replaced or some other work done. So I had probably 20 or more Viomes apart on the bench, and to see.
Wow, that's incredible.
How
What a great way to make a living, just dissecting these really unique and antique instruments to study them.
Well, this was before Viome became quite so pricey. So
Sure.
It was still an affordable instrument at that point, and it was a very serviceable instrument. And having taken enough of them apart and looked at them, I said, I can do this. That there aren't any secrets here. I mean, I see the consistency. I see what's here. So that was inspiring. That was supportive of I can do something like that. I'm not sure that. I certainly haven't yet approached the marketplace of Viome, but in some ways that is my ideal. Part of making so many instruments is seeing the production that came out of Viome's shop, and Viome's place in the market, and that's largely there because the product is so well known that there are a lot of them in a lot of different places. And so that was encouragement to that not only could I do this, but that I would be a better maker by making as many instruments as I could. That the incremental process of making each instrument a little bit better takes on steam when you make a lot of instruments. If you don't make very many instruments, you probably don't make any progress at all.
That's true. Yeah, I think in terms of content creation as well, like I think you find composers like Mozart. Mozart's compositions weren't amazing when he came out of the womb, right? As he grew older, he composed more, and I think it's about creating more, and you learn throughout the process. I want to talk about you mentioned data points. You said the word data points. That's a very mathematical, scientific kind of terminology that you said. Can you talk about, for our audience who may not be aware of the science and the mathematics that is involved in making an instrument and making a great sounding instrument?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to talk about that, but
sure, yeah.
But in terms of the data points, there are certain things that are measured. But one of the interesting things is how much the look and the feel, and I think the effectiveness of a great instrument isn't a fixed measurement, but it's how the line works together. So it's again, it's the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. It's not that you get each of the little parts right, but it's how everything flows together. So I don't know how many graduation or thickness points I have that I work with, but it's probably maybe 50 for each the top and the back, that are measured. You've got the basic dimensions, you've got arching height, you've got how the purfling sits into the channel and how the corners are shaped. One thing that I have to infer to a great extent in looking at old instruments is what is the density and the stiffness of the wood. But that's something that I pay a lot of attention to. I don't think that there is a perfect wood or a perfect density. I actually take a great deal of pleasure in working with woods that are quite different and figuring out how to get the most out of each piece of wood rather than finding the wood that's going to match the way that I make. And then I starting about 10 or 12 years ago, I started doing acoustic measurement and evaluation. So there again, for each instrument, there's probably a couple of hundred measurements that get made along in the making process.
It's kind of like a 100-point inspection.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and of course, there are certain things that you look for. And I know that you're a big fan of making copies of these antique instruments of Stradivari and Granary, like the Granary del Jesus, and I'm sure if I don't know if you've made Viom copies, but I'm sure it's in your collection of Opus,
Yeah.
right? So for the audience who may not even know that, like, what's the difference between like a Stradivari copy or like a Stradivari instrument compared to a Granary? They just see a violin in front of them, and it's just a violin. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk about some of the unique qualities between a maker like Stradivari and Granary?
Again, probably not. I'm not sure that
Or not, or yeah, or like something that you've noticed in the like in your observations when in your time in Boston, if you ever have come across those kinds of instruments.
Well, one of the main things that I learned in Boston is how different great instruments can be. Of having an instrument that really works, and it doesn't follow any of the rules. So that the 10 years in Boston was, well, I was going to say unlearning, but it was working away from the German discipline, which was this is how violins are made, and kind of a very self-assured pattern there, and coming to see that it's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than that in terms of how the different models work. Well, probably the choice of wood is going to be the thing that makes the biggest difference in the final instrument. But the different patterns have different proportions, mainly different arch. That in following a Strad arch or a Granary arch, they're just quite different, and that's going to give a different tone spectrum to the instrument.
Great, thank you for sharing all of that. And you make copies of these instruments. Is there a particular copy that you enjoy copying? Like,
So for my Opus 1000, which for a long time I didn't, that seemed like an impossible dream or goal, and partially because of the economic slowdown of 2008, and having my work focused or having less interruption. Things have gone very well. I chose the 1744 Leduc Lake Granary pattern for that instrument.
Fabulous.
Because that's the pattern that seems to turn players on the most, and it has about as much personality as one can possibly put into an instrument. I just today had a copy of a 1720 Strad in the shop that I built 25 years ago, I think, something like that. And that I might say was a copy. It was actually a bench copy. I had the Strad in hand while I was building it, and a lot of the things are right. These days, I don't. I'm beginning to think more about building instruments that are inspired by particular instruments rather than being copied by. My sense of the best instruments that I've been able to turn out are 50% the inspiration and 50% what I do with it. So they are clearly, Lorenzo Storioni is perhaps my favorite maker because of a kindred spirit feeling about the way that he works. But in doing an instrument there, I like them to be recognizable. I would like someone to be able to look at them and say, oh, this is on that pattern, or this reminds me of this. But it has to be 50% new and fresh and what I bring to it. So I mean, there are times when I've worked where it's been 20% inspiration and 80% what I do, and times vice versa, where it's 80% like the Strad copy that I was just mentioning, where that's 80% trying to copy this instrument as closely as I could, and 20% what was left over because I couldn't copy it perfectly, and so it was what I had to bring to it. And I think that just about halfway in the middle is my sweet spot of when instruments, I think, turn out the best. And it's as much as I like to think, or one can think, well, I'm making a Strad, or I'm making a Granary, or a Guadagnini, or something like this. No, I'm making a Cox. And it's a new instrument, and it's going to have a life of its own.
Right, and that's what I was going to mention. No matter how much you copy an instrument, it needs to be your personality as the maker of your instrument. I think, I'm grateful to play one of your instruments as well, and I know that it's very much your work, and I enjoy playing on this instrument, and it's also your part of your voice that I get to play, by holding the instrument in your hand. And well, man, so much to talk about, I feel like you can talk hours with instrument talk. And it's totally random question, but we're approaching the fall. We're approaching the fall and the winter time, and people who are listening to the podcast might be beginners, might be intermediate, or some are advanced and might not need to hear this. But you live in Vermont, which is like northwest New England, very cold. Winters are brutal, especially where I am in Western Massachusetts. And for people playing your instruments, or for people playing any kind of instrument, do you have any tips or any advice on how to keep your instrument in tip-top shape as we approach the fall and approach the winter? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, avoid extremes. Wood is an amazingly living thing. It's not only living because it comes from a tree, but it's living because it changes. Well, by the time an instrument gets to be 300 years old, it's pretty well stabilized and isn't going to be changing that much. But it probably still is, And I think of the instruments when they walk out the door of my shop in someone's hands and they're starting their career, they are half done. That what I'm able to do here in the shop and all of the making is half of the process, and the other half is going to be time and the playing. That how an instrument played makes a tremendous difference. That my personality is in the instrument, the personality of the people who play it is also going to be in the instrument. And then there's just the things that I try to imagine and anticipate of what's going to happen to the wood, what's going to happen to the instrument if I make it this way. But that's just going to unfold on the instrument's own time. But back to your question, particularly in the winter, try to keep the humidity of the instrument as constant as possible. And that, it goes both for summer and for winter. What I think is is ideal if you can keep the humidity around the instrument down to 60% in the summer and up to 40% in the winter. I don't particularly think it's prudent or necessarily good for the instrument to try to keep the humidity absolutely the same throughout the year. Because, well, at least hopefully in the post-COVID time, people are going to be going out with their instruments and playing in all kinds of places. And you're not going to have control over the humidity 24 hours a day.
That's true. I'm only thinking about all those I'm just thinking about all those wedding musicians who are going to be rescheduled for like hundreds of weddings for next year, and just stay adamant about that humidity level, people.
So just try to stay away from the extremes. I think just do what you can to humidify in the winter and to avoid extreme humidity conditions in the summer, if you can. That's the main thing. Everything else kind of flows out of that. I mean that changes in the humidity can cause seams to come open, which then need to be glued. They can change neck angles and string height and the fit of the post, and all of these other things kind of get shifted around. But mostly those aren't things that a player should worry too much about. I think seams. That is the joint between the top and the back and the ribs is a good thing to keep an eye on.
And also for anyone who's listening and watching, if that does happen, those tend to be actually quite costly repairs, to fix open seams. And especially during the wintertime, I know that certain instruments, like 300, 400-year-old instruments, people who play those kinds of violins, they have to be very adamant about that humidity level. So that way, you're pretty much, you're still playing this antique that's been built for, many years ago. So it's trying to stay adamant. And I think a good suggestion you made is to avoid the extremes. I think, trying to have a progression, like if the weather's going to be colder, is to slowly progress the instrument into that time, into that weather, and kind of adjusting it. It'll probably adjust on its own, at least in my experience with other instruments.
Right, but we just want it to adjust slowly.
Adjust slowly, yes. I think that's the biggest part. And I want to transition into another topic that you may have or have not talked about, but someone on the podcast might wonder, well, does this person make bows? And I want you to explain to the audience what the differences are between like a bow maker and a violin maker, if you have any thoughts on that. And I don't know if you make any bows. Do you make bows?
I don't.
You don't?
When I was working in the shop in Boston, I did basic bow service as part of my working my way up through the shop. And I
like bow rehairs and
right and replacing tips and doing some fairly simple crack repair and things like that. And I thought that I should make a couple of bows just to understand the process, but I never did that. But bow making is different material. It's a different technology, different tools. It's just different, and which isn't to say that someone who it's just different. So if someone does both, they're going to have two different skills rather than one skill leading to the other.
Sure. Okay.
The main thing that's constant between it is that it's the same clientele. So that, if you're servicing bows and instruments, you can be a one-shop place, and that can be a good thing. But in terms of being good at one does not give you much of a head start on being good at the other. So I've made maybe half a dozen cellos in my life, but I basically decided that cellos are enough different in the that I've stopped making cellos. So I just make violins and violas. And there are other makers who make only cellos. So that's another place where things get differentiated.
You also mentioned the word clientele, and it depends on, the clientele. When you're approached from a player or from an organization to commission a violin for this particular player, do you consider the person's playing? Do you consider what are the kind of steps that you go through in your head when someone commissions a violin from you? Do you I guess I'll just leave the question there.
Yeah, I fortunately I don't have to do a lot of commission work. That I have a significant inventory. That being a maker and not a business operator,
Sure.
I haven't let slowness of orders slow down my work. And again, my goal has been to make as many instruments as I can, not necessarily to sell as many instruments as I can. So I do have inventory, and that makes it a lot easier because when I was, younger, I was doing the commission order route, and that gets into so many problems of language and perception that have to get worked through, and it seems like they always get worked through in an imperfect way. Whereas if someone picks up a violin and plays it, then we can actually find meaningful language that we can both understand based on the playing.
I guess that helps if you have a large inventory. You know what direction the player wants to go, like, because you have a wide selection.
Right. And I'm probably pretty much toward the extreme in violin makers of working on a very wide range of instruments. Big, small, high arched, low arched, just lots of different inspirations. So that
wide body instruments, narrow body instruments.
Yeah, and while I think that again, it kind of comes around to the 50-50, proposition that I think anyone should pick up one of my instruments and find me in it. Okay, well, this feels and this plays like a Doug Cox instrument. I mean, I would like that to happen, but I also want each instrument to have its own unique voice, and so half of it is the consistent me of who I am, who I can't help not doing it differently, and the other 50% is what is unique and special about this particular model and choice of wood and what's there. So. What was the question again?
No, it was just about, I think it was all just about commissioning violins from different violinists. If you ever done that in the past, or if you have done it, what was the checklist of things that you did work for? But you pretty much answered the question in saying that you really don't do that anymore. And let's say you just say what kind of instrument or what your ideal instrument or what your ideal type of playing, whether it's solo, chamber music, or whatever the case may be, and then go from and then stem it from there, right?
Yeah, no, I think those are the first thing is a bright sound or a dark sound. That is one of the things that either makes an instrument work or not work. Probably the next is what is the bow technique of, does the player play with a heavy bow or with a light, with a heavy hand on their bow, or with a lighter, more floating hand, and that takes things into very different directions. Then there's sort of related to the heavy hand is that heavy hand leads naturally to more raw power. So, and this is the question of what kind of playing are you going to be doing? Are you going to be on a concert stage in front of an orchestra, or are you going to be, in in a string quartet where you need a particular blend. You're going to be in an orchestra where comfort and consistency of sound is more important than probably anything else. So it's I have an evaluation form that I use with players and with instruments that has, I think, 8 different criteria, and tone, color, response, flexibility. There's a sort of an undefinable quality of sound, which is kind of like a fine cup of coffee or a nice wine.
Right. Everyone's going to think of it differently. Everyone's going to say something different.
Well, no, but there's something there, that there is something very interesting and unique and that grabs you in the sound. So if an instrument has that quality, you can't necessarily describe it, but there is something that kind of percolates up. I have some sense of how to do that in different ways, and what, how the wood and the graduation works to give a different quality to the sound. But an instrument with a high quality quotient may lose on some of the other issues. Which is the way this always works. Is that at least as far as I've been able to get to, it's always a trade-off. But that where we're aiming to make the perfect instrument, the one that scores 10 on everything.
Absolutely. That's always the goal. Yeah. Doug, before we go, there's one last question I want to ask you. What is the amount of, right now you just passed 1,000 violins that you made. I think you are like at 1,020 based on your last Instagram post or something in that range. What is the number for you? What is how many violins or instruments, for that matter, are you happy making? Like 1,500? Maybe the next milestone will be 1,500.
That 1,000 has crossed my mind several times over the years. As that sometimes I felt as though I was on track for that, and other times I said, no way. Well, I think I don't have a number. I don't have a number. I think that I've heard violin dealers or experts talk about Strad having made something in the neighborhood of 1,200 instruments. That came out of, well, he didn't make them, but they came out of his shop. They were out of his
right.
Out of his workshop. I think that I still feel the more the more the merrier. That the more instruments I make, the better instruments I will make. At this point, it may be slightly downhill. Of I'm not sure they're necessarily going to get much better, but I think that if I keep working, they'll get less good, less fast. Does that?
I guess yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So the more the merrier. The more violins you make, the happier people get to play on them. The more, I think that's.
I hope so. Yep, I certainly hope so. And I mean, I obviously wouldn't get to this point if the work at the bench weren't a joy. Not to say that it's 100% of the time, but enough of the time, and that's where life feels good. That's where everything seems to come together.
Enjoying the process
in a harmonious way.
Mm-hmm. Well, Doug, I want to thank you so much for coming on to this week's episode of the Everyday Musician podcast. How can people find you? I know that you're online, you're on Instagram. Can you share where people can find, how to find you?
Well, I think the easiest and the most direct is coxviolins.com. We try to have an attractive and informative website. And I think most things can be found through that. There's an extensive set of blogs that I've written at various times with kind of general background information of or following the process of particular instruments. But and in terms of getting in touch with me through the website's probably the easiest way. There's a email portal on the website.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I will leave all of that in the podcast description notes for anyone who's interested in learning more about Doug's violins. And Doug, thank you again so much. And if you like this episode of the Violin Podcast, if you made it this far, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Please make sure to subscribe, share the episode with anyone who might enjoy it. And we will have you hopefully on a future episode of the Violin Podcast. I think it'll be great to know and maybe pick your mind a little bit more with maybe more topics.
Well, thanks to you for the podcast, and thanks to your listeners for making the world a more beautiful place through their playing. That's what makes my life worthwhile. So, appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.